there was a time when Provender actually played a small role in something that was very important for the nation. And Tilth played a somewhat larger role. But basically, what it came down to is this. In 1988, 89, you might remember there was the big Alar scare where moms were discovering that this really toxic chemical was on the apples in their applesauce that they were giving their babies. And fortunately, we had a celebrity who got involved in that. That was Meryl Streep. Thank you, Meryl. No, I don't know her personally. I just remember that she was a spokesperson about this problem with the apples. And of course, those of us who had espoused eating natural and organic foods for a long time were like, well, yeah, thanks for finally getting on the bandwagon. You know, we could use a few more voices like that, because it really became big news then that this was a potential problem to be feeding children, me too, stuff that really actually wasn't good to eat. And so out of that, there developed suddenly a much stronger interest in organic food from people who didn't understand what organic food was, but assumed that meant it was without chemicals. And suddenly it was hard to keep organic foods in stock. And of course, growers and manufacturers were scrambling to meet the demand and having a good time doing it, I would assume, as we all were. It's like, wow, we have new customers. This is great. But what happened was it gave some leverage to the awareness that we needed to have a legalized standard for what constituted organic food. We did not have that. It had never existed. It was just sort of a popular understanding or misunderstanding, as the case may be, about what food ought to be. And so the conversation began in various parts of the country. And remember, this is before the internet. This is before you had any way to communicate someone except meeting them, talking to them on the phone, or writing them a letter and sending it in the mail. So some of the conversations were about, we really need to get this codified in law, because right now anybody can put anything on whatever they're growing, bring it to you, and sell it as organic. We don't have any way to prove that it isn't. And so one of the great minds of our time, Lynn Cody, who was also an old friend of mine, who was working as an organic agricultural consultant, and I believe probably still is. In 1989, 1990, she began meeting together with one of our local organic farmers here, Jack Gray of Wintergreen Farm, and they were working out, and Organically Grown Company was also involved. They were working out and drafting proposed legislation at the state level to define organic standards at the state level. And they were both Tilth participants, Oregon Tilth. And I got wind of what they were doing, and I showed up at their meetings and said,
I'm crashing this party.
I'm crashing this party because I'm the president of Provender this year, and manufacturers and retailers and distributors need to be part of this discussion, because we have to have this standard defined in a way that works all the way through the food chain so the consumer knows what they're getting. And they acknowledged that that was a wise choice, and they included me in the meetings. Now, my role compared to theirs was quite minor, because they had already done a lot of the footwork and knew what they were doing at that point. But there were some important contributions that I made as Provender member, and I pulled in Harold Tobin from Serrata Soy Foods, who was at that time with Serrata Soy Foods, to represent the manufacturing side, to point out to them, for example, you cannot say that every single ingredient in an organic food must be organic, because when we make tofu, for example, most of it is organic, but we're using water. The water has to be described some way, and we can't call the water organic. And we're using nigari, which is made from seawater, and that's what's used to curdle the soy milk into tofu. It's only about 0.5% of the finished product, but it's in there, and we can't label seawater organic. There's no way to define that. So after several more discussions, we were able to include in the legislation a better definition of what growers would do, what the farmers would do that could be called organic, what retailers would do in order to be called an organic retailer, of which there are a few, and what food processors or manufacturers could do, and how they could label things, and what percentage of non-organic product could be in something that was called organic, and what sort of non-organic ingredients were permissible. And that all got worked out, and it was a pretty good law, and we took it to the Oregon State Legislature, and by golly, they passed it, first shot. And we had
It was very well written.
and we had a consumer who showed up at our last meeting and chimed in and said, I want to know that we're going to know X and Y as consumers when this is done. And we realized we couldn't promise that. And Lynn started talking about, and this is the first time I had heard the word that is now everyone's catchphrase, which is sustainability. Lynn started explaining that what we had to do was we could not label something organic as being chemical free. That wasn't the point, because there are also organic chemicals like rotenone.
Uranium's organic.
Yeah, uranium is, yeah, well, there are naturally occurring biological agents that are used in organic farming, but the difference is they do not persist in the environment. They break down very quickly into non-toxic substances, and they don't deplete or damage the soil, water, or air. And so she began using, and this is the first time I'd ever heard this used, she started using the term sustainability to talk about what organics was about. So from that point on, I began promoting both within Provender and on a broader level, the idea of selling organics not as something that had an absence of pesticides, but as something that was promoting sustainability in a holistic way, where the land, the air, and the water are cared for. So the following year, an effort was convened on the national level to draft organic standards legislation. And while that was going on, an interesting thing happened within the industry. A major retailer in the Northeast, who shall remain nameless, came out in all the trade journals with their op-ed opinion about how the legislation that was being drafted was going in the wrong direction. They were saying that what we needed was to be able to assure our customers that organic food was chemical-free, period. And there's no way to guarantee that. There can be pesticide drift, et cetera, et cetera. You hope it's minimal, but whatever. Anyway, there was no way to guarantee that, and this got published in the trade journals. And I, as the Provender president, was, that would totally wreck everything we're trying to do. It's not practical, for one thing. You cannot guarantee that there was never any kind of chemical that got near your field.
In the background.
You can do your best, but you can't guarantee that by the time it gets into the apple bin, that someone hasn't touched it somewhere along the line with a trace of chemicals on their fingers, whatever, in the air. And so that's not the way to describe it. Even though it's more likely to be chemical-free, that's not the way to describe it unless you want a whole lot of lawsuits going on.
And it's not the whole story.
Yeah, and it's not the whole story. It doesn't really describe what we're trying to do, where we're going. So this was still back in the day, no internet and no electric typewriter even. I mean, they existed, but I didn't own one. And there was no one else around to take up this charge, so And in fact, that was the year where for several months I wasn't working in a regular job, so I didn't have a business to call on for their resources. And I sat down with an old clunky manual typewriter and I composed a letter that I wanted to go to every retailer and person in the industry, that just as that trade journal had done. And then I took the letter to Sundance because I thought they would help. Thank goodness for Sundance Natural Foods. I talked to David Resegi and he said, I think I can get you a printout of most of the retailers in the country. I'm like, you can? I don't know how he did it. But he did give me this long list, and I sent it to every retailer that I could find, hundreds of people. This is me making photocopies by hand, stamping letters, writing addresses, sending this everywhere. And I sent it also to the people who were drafting the legislation, so they would be in the, included in every step of the conversation. And I sent it, one of the people I sent it to was Tom Forster, who was actually in Washington, D.C., working to lobby for this. And he was so kind as to send me back a letter, because I told him when I sent it to him, I've sent this to all the people in the industry I can find. Please get on board with what you're trying to do. And these are the reasons. And I was able to say, in the Northwest, we are fortunate to have created, and I called it a vertical integration of ideas in our industry. The retailers, the manufacturers, the distributors, and the growers are talking about what works and what doesn't, and what our customers need to know, and what our overall view is. And we're looking at this holistically. What we want to focus on is creating sustainability, not avoiding chemicals. And I was much more eloquent than that. And I sent it everywhere. I sent it to Tom Forster. I told him I'd send it everywhere. I got a letter back from him that said, thank God you're doing that. He said, I can't believe that op-ed that came out. He said, it really is getting in our way, because people will listen to that unless someone like you talks to them. So I was very glad for that, and I felt like I played a small role in getting all the players on board with what had to be done. So.
And that's really that's another thing that I like about this group, about having Provender as a resource, is that you're not the only person who has a story like that.
Right.
Where people feel that the very atmosphere, or the fact that Provender's there and the context within which Provender operates empowers people to do that. Well, okay, so this isn't working, so what can we do about this? What can you do? And people will say, okay, I will do this part, I will do this part. And you were right at home in that kind of environment, because you're the kind of person who says, well, I have to say something about this. I can't rest unless this is taken care of. And there are other like-minded people who are with you with that, like Craig Winters, some of the other folks that we worked with over time, that really stood up and said, hey, wait, no, here's where we need to be. Here's how we need to frame this argument, or here's how we need to put this, because it's more than just this granular little piece of profit.
Right, like the retailer from the Northeast had looked at it through one particular lens, and I had been fortunate, because of the connections we built in the Northwest, to see it through several different lenses, throughout the food distribution system, and go, whoa, that is not going to work.
And here you are advocating for junk in the food.
Yeah. Not really, but
right,
yeah.
I know, but it puts you in this weird position. But because you had this context around you, and you had people behind you that said, yes, Marta, yes, that also helps. And you had David. David stepped up and said,
thank goodness.
Oh yeah, and so I think that there still is a place for that. There still is a place for
grassroots,
an organization like Provender that tells people you have permission to go out and make something change, and we will stand with you. We will stand with you if you're supporting this concept of of like the web, you know, of us being connected together, and sustainability, and well-being and health in all areas, not just in food or in your pocketbook, but you know, in your psychic and your whole mental health. And as I'm rambling off rambling, but you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So that it's in that context that having permission to do as an individual an important work, knowing that you have these people behind you.
Yeah.